morning from the book of Second Kings, nearly the end of the book. We could also read this story in Second Chronicles, but Second Kings has a little bit more detail, so that's where we're going to read it from. So I'm picking up in Second Kings chapter 25, verses 27 through 30. In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah, Evil-merodach ascended the Babylonian throne. That can't be good, right? If the guy, the other name in the story, his first name is Evil. It's actually pronounced more like Ilwol, I think, but I don't really speak Hebrew. I speak Southern English. So we're going to go with Evil-merodach. Ascended to the Babylonian throne. He was kind to Jehoiachin. Oh, well, there's another twist in the story. And released him from prison on April 2nd of that year. He spoke kindly to Jehoiachin and gave him a higher place than all the other exiled kings in Babylon. He supplied Jehoiachin with new clothes to replace his prison garb and allowed him to dine in the king's presence for the rest of his life. So the king gave him a regular food allowance as long as he lived. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. If you're reading through the end of Second Kings or Second Chronicles, it doesn't matter. It's brutal. Now, if you have no context on which to hang the history of Israel and Judah, it can also be a little bit garbled because you run into words like Evil-merodach or Jehoiachin, or as Zoe so adeptly pronounced this morning, Sidkenu, and you're like, I'm kind of lost on the verbiage here. So just know that the end of this story is painful because it is the end of the story. When I was in Old Testament class in seminary, our professor, Bill Arnold, as he was teaching this part of it, he openly wept as he told the story. He said, I've been teaching this class for decades, and I can't teach this part without crying because it is so devastating. And I thought to myself, I want to know the story of Israel and Judah so well that after 20 years of teaching this story, it still brings me to tears. What is it about this story, even if we know what comes next, that is so particularly devastating as we read it? Well, it is brutal. Last week we talked about the reform and the revival of Josiah, and it's given to us in glorious detail. I mean, it's like you're getting king after king after king, and then you get to Josiah, and the writers, the chroniclers of the kings, give us chapters worth of information about this King Josiah. And they slow the narrative down so that you catch every little detail from that event. But like a car with the cruise control on, God's people are hurtling toward being exiled of the promised land. And that exile, that being kicked out of the promised land, is a fixed and unavoidable consequence of their rebellion and disobedience. And the driver of that car, Judah, the kings of Judah particularly, seem uninterested in either slowing the vehicle, like they are not pumping the brakes, nor are they veering from the path of that set and fixed disastrous outcome. Do y'all experience your cruise control like this? There's this phenomenon that happens to me, and maybe I'm just a bad driver, but when I set my cruise control and I see, off in the distance, there's a car in my lane, and obviously I'm creeping closer to it, which means if I'm using my cruise control, they are going slower than I am, right? If the distance, I think that's how physics works. If the distance is getting shorter between us, I'm going faster, or they're going slower, or perhaps both, right? And here's the thing that happens to me, is it seems to be going at a certain pace, which of course it is, at exactly the same pace, but the closer I get, it seems like the faster I'm getting closer to their bumper. where I thought, okay, good, y'all experience this too, where it seems like I have a little more time than I thought I had, and then suddenly I've got to get over, right? Okay, this is how the end of Second Kings happens, where we see in the horizon this unavoidable and certain fixed future that God is saying, you're out. I gave you chance after chance after chance after chance, and you're not going to sit and reap the blessings of my land after I told you stop acting like that. You can't live under my roof and act like fools, is what God is telling the children of Judah. And it's fixed. It's coming. They're heading straight toward it. Josiah, though, it kind of slows it all down. And you think for a minute, it's going to be fine. And then Josiah's son, and the next one, and the next one, and you are just boom, 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 and you're slap on it. And that's how the book of Kings ends. We do not get much detail about Manasseh and the rest of them that come after Josiah until we hit headlong into Jehoiachin and the overthrow and the deportation. The other thing that's true about reading the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, it is that the story is an inverse of the story of the conquest. Let me tell you what I mean. Back to our earliest stories of Jesus' lineage, okay? When Joshua, like as in Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, that Joshua, right? The walls came tumbling down. We watched the VeggieTales version of it. Okay, that Joshua, who's not in the lineage of Jesus, but his buddy Salmon was, who married Rahab, who we found out was the prostitute who became one of the great-great-grandmas of Jesus, right? Okay, this group right here, if you go and look back at their story, and you see how Joshua and Salmon and the rest of them took over the land, they basically, it was a conquest, but the right word, there it is, rescued. They rescued the land from the bloodthirsty Canaanites, where the Canaanites that had inhabited the land were just, they were slaughtering babies, and it was an ugly scene. God's people came in. God gave them victory over the land so that God's promises and God's blessing and God's way and God's law could prevail in that place, and peace could be extended to all of these people groups. Joshua, Salmon, and then we get the story of Ruth and Boaz. Remember Ruth and Boaz in the grain field? And then they have a kiddo named Jesse. And then we get to David and Solomon. And if you tell that story in the order of going from crossing that river into Jericho all the way to the beautiful temple that Solomon builds, and as you read that story, like every little piece of furniture, every little item that they bring into the temple is told in glorious details up until the final moment where Solomon gets to say, ta-da! This part right here in 2 Kings, it's almost like someone hits the rewind button and it reverses itself. Because the Babylonians come in, and first they take all the gold furnishings out of the temple. And then they destroy the temple walls and gates. And then as they leave Jerusalem in ruins and rubble and fire, they lead the people and they force them to walk the same path and cross the same rivers into Babylon that they had first entered in so long ago. And not only that, as if that's not painful enough to read it in inverse order like that, but the few people that are left behind who still have some freedom and some power and some agency, they go to Egypt for help. Necho is on the throne. He is the Pharaoh of Egypt. And they go to Necho and ask him, hey, can you come help us? Because Babylon is trying to take over. Necho already has an alliance with Babylon, doesn't tell them that, and it just gets worse. And here's where we are. The people of God, who had been rescued by God's hand out of Egypt, given the promised land, where a temple is built in the middle of that city and the Spirit of God comes and inhabits that temple. They have just hit reverse by their actions of disobedience and rebellion to the point where they are literally back in Egypt and saying, Pharaoh, can you help us? How'd we get here? Have you ever asked that question about yourself? How'd I get back here? I said I would never do that again. I would never let myself get in this shape again. I would never let myself get in this position again. I would never let myself get this bad off again. And yet here I am, nevering like I've never nevered before. It's taught that there were editors who came back and helped fashion and shape what we know as the Torah, the Pentateuch, the law of God, in such a way that when we read it, it becomes obvious what was wrong after King Josiah. Where we can draw a straight line and go, God said, do this, and they did that. God said, don't do that, and they did it. And it's written that way. It's given to us in the form that it's given, so that when we get to this point in the story, and the people of God are in Egypt, do you feel that? They're in Egypt, saying, Pharaoh, can you help us? It's absurd and it's obscene that as we read the story, we say, they knew. They knew what was coming. Why did they do it? We knew. We knew what the consequences of our actions were. Why did we do it? It's so that when we read the story, we don't conclude, well, Nebuchadnezzar, the king who took them into Babylon, it's not that he was smarter, stronger, or somehow better than the kings of Judah. It's not that the kings of Judah were somehow incompetent, incapable of being kings. No, we're not trying to disparage the line of the kings, especially this line that leads to Jesus. What we're saying is they knew better, but they did not do better. And so we can read the story and say, they did it to themselves. And it's not that God abandoned them either. It's that they abandoned God and they are left to their consequences. And consequences are a drag, are they not? Huh. So how do we live our life in such a way that we're not always having to reap the fruit of our consequences? What a great question. What a great question. And then we get to this passage. In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. All right, so track the numbers on that. The 37th year of King Jehoiachin. He's been in prison for nearly 4 decades. And on April 2nd of that year, don't you want to know what happened on April 2nd? The king of Babylon, who is, he has come just after Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was on the throne, and then his son, Evil-merodach, takes the throne. And he's only on the throne for 2 years, and something overcomes him. And he reaches out in mercy and kindness toward Jehoiachin, who's been in prison all this time. And we read the text, and it's supposed to bubble up in us this excitement, this joy. Because up until now, we have felt the dread. We have seen, and it's not a vehicle moving slowly, it is a wall of destruction that Judah is hurtling toward with unavoidable and very intentional speed. And they are about to be obliterated against this wall. And then suddenly, this small kind of crack comes. And the writer of Kings says, he spoke kindly to Jehoiachin, and he supplied him with new clothes, and he gave him a regular food allowance as long as he lived. He was given a permission to eat at the table. And some of you smarty pants, I'm not going to give this away yet. We're going to do it in just a minute. But I want you to be imagining, what New Testament story does that? Don't say it. Just think it. Where are we going? Hope is not dead. A remnant, a seed, a branch remains even in exile. Even though they have dragged their lousy selves back to Egypt, these people. It's not a powerful branch. It's not leading anything. It's not even free, really. But it's alive. And this final word about the kings of Judah is the preservation of the bloodline of Jesus. And what's fun is, now that you know the whole story, you get to read it like that. You get to read it with the historians and go, wait. He rescued Jehoiachin? Of all the people he could have rescued, he has kindness toward Jehoiachin? I know that guy. I know him. He becomes the grandfather of Zerubbabel, is what you thought, right? Because 500 years before Jesus is born in Bethlehem, a man named Zerubbabel is given permission to take the Jews back to Jerusalem. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but this is how the story begins to stack, okay? And this is an appropriate place to be in our story as we begin Advent, because we are truly sitting with the people at the river of Babylon and crying out with them, oh come, Emmanuel, and rescue captive Israel. That's where we are in the story. Now we know how it ends. And so maybe we don't feel quite as devastated, because we're like, hey, just hold on. Just hold on, because Zerubbabel's coming. And Jesus is coming. And so when we find ourselves in our own exile, when we have dragged our ridiculous tales back to our own Egypts, when we have sat at the table of our consequences one more time, and we're eating the meal that we have set for ourselves, I want us to know that this is just as much our story too. We have a God who has come to rescue us. And Christ the King reigns. It should both trouble us that those who were entrusted to keep the promise, I don't know if you remember, we talked about this way back with Judah and Tamar, and how Judah refused to have a child, and how that was wrong of him, because every male Jew was supposed to be responsible for knowing he could be the bloodline of the Messiah. And Tamar rescues the bloodline of Jesus by demanding that Judah do the right thing. Okay, here we are all the way to this point. We're like, you guys, you were supposed to do the right thing. The promise was entrusted to you. Come on. It's supposed to bother us. But it's also a story that's supposed to give us great hope. It should amaze us that even here, even with this history, even as they are dragged backwards through their own history and right back into slavery, that God's grace is still there. Practice saying this with me. But God. But God. That's what we say in the dark, y'all. It's not a denial. We can look headlong at what's coming. Know that it's so dark that I can't see my hand in front of my face. I don't know. We already practiced that prayer. I don't know what to do, but God. Even when we are without faith, God is faithful. God's faithfulness does not depend on ours. God's goodness does not depend on ours. God's mercy and compassion does not depend on ours. God's salvation does not depend on your goodness. God is saving, God is moving, God is providing, God is healing, God is rescuing in spite of us. The question is, do we participate in it? Or do we sit and wait for the consequences of our actions to erode our lives, the foundation of our lives, in the very next storm? Recently, there was a storm that hit one of the coasts of Florida. I think it was the most recent one. And I don't mean to exploit the pain of these people, but I was impacted by the visuals that came out of this storm. The way that this storm hit this particular city, you saw these huge houses. Like they had to have been, probably some of $1 million houses on these shores of Florida. And the way the storm had just taken out the foundation under them, so that the house was kind of still standing, but you knew you couldn't inhabit it anymore, right? Because there was literally nothing underneath it. Like any minute, that whole house was about to fall into the sea. And you saw where the waves just kept grabbing more layers of sand, and it was just a matter of time. Friends, when we choose the things that God says, hey, don't do that, when we do them anyway, we are building our house on sand. And it will stand up for a while. It will. You can build all kinds of things on sand. And it will be fine. And even beautiful. And people may compliment the life that you've built on the sand. People may envy the life you've built on the sand. But you know inside of you, it's just sand. And it starts to shift and crack. And you know, the next storm could be it. This could be the storm that rips the sand out from under and the whole thing. Jesus tells a story like that too. Jesus' solution is house on the, some of y'all learned that story in Sunday school, Vacation Bible School. Rock. The answer is rock. Build it on the rock. And the rock is Jesus. Yeah. Meaning, we build our lives on the foundation and principles of God. And when we do that, sometimes we don't get to build the fancy house that gets built on the sand, because that's faster. But the house that's built on the rock, it weathers storms. The house that's built on the rock isn't immune to storms. It's a house that weathers storms. This is the difference. This is the mistake that Judah made, and it's told to us so that we can read it and not say, those foolish people. We can say, oh, I ought to build my house on the rock, not on the sand. Okay, but what if? What if we've gone ahead and done it? What if we've built our house on sand? A good mixture, sandy clay. Anybody live in Mississippi? You know what I'm talking about, right? What if? We just have to wait? We just have to wait for the storm to come and knock it all down? This is where God's grace comes in. Even when we are in Babylon, in prison, there is one who will come and say, come out. Put on some new clothes and come sit at my table. I have a place for you. But what about my house of sand? Isn't it funny that we can be scared of leaving that behind? Like, we know the next storm is going to tear it down, but it's still ours, right? It's still what we've built. It's still the whole life that we've built. Can I just tell you, after 20-something years of walking with individuals and with families, I know that it's really hard to just turn your back on this life that you've built, and there are connections and people and, frankly, addictions that go with the whole life, that it's hard to walk over here and do this whole new thing. But can I tell you that the grace of God sustains you? And if you will begin to walk in the direction that God is calling you in, to build this new life on His foundation, you will. I promise it. I promise it on everything I know and believe to be true, that you will reach a place in your life where you will look back at that and think, what did I love about that? How could I have thought that that was life? That was death. I lived in a house of death. Because Jesus has come to us as Emmanuel, and because He is raised from the dead for us, we have the power and the tools and the knowledge and the ability to build a new house. But it's a building process, and you can't build both at the same time. You can't walk in both directions at the same time. We're either building a house on sand, or we're building a house on the foundation of Christ. The grace and mercy of God is this: because you have heard the word and responded, I will save you. So God invites us to turn around, to come back, to rebuild on a better foundation, to restock with better equipment, to reshape our lives around God's blessings and not our blunders. Because see, that's how we often get dragged back to our house of sand, is we start building this new life with Christ, and the enemy comes in and he says, you don't deserve that life. I know what you've done. Let me remind you of what a fool you were, of how awful you were, of all the things you don't deserve in that house, to live in that house that Jesus has built for you. Get yourself back over to this house of sand. And that's when we are required to tell the enemy that he's a liar. I don't deserve the house that Jesus has built for me because of me. I get to live in the house that Jesus has built for me because Jesus is good. That's all I have to tell the enemy. I don't have to build my life around my blunders. I am not the sum of my mistakes, and neither are you. I get to build a new life on Christ and because of the mercy that He has shown me. We, meaning we, us in this room, we love to sing this song, don't we, Sean, about the Jesus who leaves the 99 and goes after the one, the reckless love of Jesus. We love to sing that song. Y'all know the song I'm talking about. And it's absolutely true. It is absolutely true. Jesus is that way. He will go after the one. He will climb any mountain and knock down any wall, and all the things that we sing, light it all up, coming after us. There was a poet in a different century that described God as the hound of heaven. You know, a hound dog going after its prey, like where it just wouldn't leave us alone and wouldn't leave us alone. And that is how Jesus is. The Holy Spirit comes after us. But like like a parent who would go down any seedy, dark, gross alleyway to find their child in a brothel. Or the sponsor who will visit every single bar on a weekend to find their sponsee. Or a spouse who'll go to the hotel to find their spouse in the arms of another one. Who would seek and seek and seek until they find, and yet get there and love that child, or love that addict, or love that spouse enough to say, I'm not dragging you home. I just wanted you to see that I will come after you no matter. I will never leave you in your darkness, and I will never leave you to your darkness. You can have your darkness, but I will always come with the light. That is how Jesus comes after us. Satan will drag you to hell, but Jesus will not drag you to heaven. You always, every day that you wake up with breath in your body, you always have a choice to go home. You have not blown it. You are not without options. But love, it will always be your choice. You can walk into destruction, and he will let you, weeping all the way. Or you can walk into life. But you cannot go in both directions. So please make sure, whatever life you are building right now, whatever truth you are living right now, that it is not destroying you and the people that you love. Make sure it's the way that